Good evening. I am Dr. Clarissa Myrick Harris, Chair of the Humanities Division of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to the first event of the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative. Keep Pushing, an intergenerational conversation commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Atlanta Student Movement. This event and the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative more broadly is an outgrowth of discussions of the Committee to Commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement, an informal group of approximately 50 people, including veterans of the movement, faculty, and students from Morehouse and Spelman Colleges, Clark Atlanta University, and other schools in the Atlanta University Center, and other Atlanta Regional Council for Higher Education institutions. Among our number are also individuals who are with organizations such as the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Apex Museum. The committee also includes public officials and community advocates. Again, the purpose of all that we do is to commemorate and raise awareness of the origins and impact of the Atlanta student movement, honor the leaders and foot soldiers of that movement, and perhaps most important, identify the lessons that we can all learn to assist us in the current ongoing battle for social justice, civil, and human rights in this country. Thank you to Morehouse College and to the Rich Foundation for their support of events of the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative that will occur over the upcoming year. And now I want to take a moment to put the Atlanta student movement in a larger context. The student sit-ins that occurred in Atlanta beginning in March 1960 were a part of the wave of protests, primarily by Black students across the South, initially sparked by a sit-in of North Carolina AT&T students in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Woolworth's lunch counter in February 1960. Ultimately, thousands of students would participate in sit-ins, marches, picket lines, and other demonstrations from New Orleans to Jacksonville, from Baltimore to Tallahassee. In Atlanta, the student activism also spurred the larger Black community to participate in boycotts of local stores and restaurants to protest segregation and racism. The participants in the pre-recorded conversation you're about to hear will discuss how students in the Atlanta University Center became a part of the wave and what made the Atlanta student movement unique. There's a reason we are launching our series of events on October 19th. That reason will be shared during the course of the conversation. Suffice it to say at this point that a sit-in, which occurred on October 19th, 1960, at the Rich's department store in downtown Atlanta, sparked a series of events that would impact the presidential election of 1960, just a couple of weeks later. You will hear the details of that shortly. Those in this conversation include three of the movement's veterans, the primary author of the manifesto of the Atlanta Student Movement, An Appeal for Human Rights, a major player of the Atlanta Student Movement Leadership's Committee on the Appeal for Human Rights, and a foot soldier of the movement who was a young freshman at Spelman at the time. Two students in the Atlanta University Center are also a part of the discussion, one from Morehouse College and another from Clark Atlanta University. The moderator of this conversation is Reverend Alvalin Sanders Swafford, award-winning producer and director of the documentary Foot Soldiers, class of 1964, pastor of St. James AME Church in Birmingham, Alabama, and daughter of Dr. George Ann Thomas, one of the Atlanta Student Movement veterans on the panel today. At the end of the intergenerational conversation, Atlanta City Councilman Michael Julian Bond, the son of Atlanta Student Movement leader, the late Julian Bond, will read a proclamation honoring the 60th anniversary of the Atlanta Student Movement and an appeal for human rights. We will devote an upcoming virtual event to a symposium and to a roll call of all the veterans of the Atlanta student movement who are still with us and those who have made their transition to the next realm of existence. In March, we'll convene that symposium entitled The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lessons from the Atlanta Student Movement. Also in March 2021, the outdoor exhibit Movement will be mounted at sites in the Atlanta University Center and downtown Atlanta. Although the conversation you're about to hear was pre-recorded, participants will be watching with you, myself included. So feel free to put your comments and questions in your Facebook comment box. And when possible, we will respond. In one of his last conversations with the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, primary founder and leader of the Atlanta student movement, Morehouse man Lonnie King Jr., who was not related to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., but a friend of his, Lonnie King Jr. said, "I'm sad when I reflect back and see how much hope and promise we had for ourselves and America. But then you began to examine the ensuing years of the 1960s to where we are today, and you realize that the descendants of segregationists and their supporters never really gave up in trying to turn the clock back. I'm also disillusioned by the fact that we perceived and were lulled into a feeling that everything is going to be all right. And now we look up and we realize we deceived ourselves. We should have kept working and kept pushing." I hope you all enjoy and are inspired by Keep Pushing, an intergenerational conversation commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Atlanta student movement and an appeal for human rights.
Greetings. I am Alvelyn Sanders Swafford, and I am extremely honored to be among greatness on this day, to be in this virtual space as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Atlanta student movement. I welcome our panelists to this virtual conversation. It is called Keep Pushing, an intergenerational conversation commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Atlanta student movement. Welcome to all of you. I'm so glad that you are here, that you are joining us for this special time, and really for such a time as this in our country. Just to introduce who we have with us today, we have Dr. Rosalind Pope, who is the primary author of An Appeal for Human Rights. And she's also the former president of the Student Government Association for Spelman College. She's a retired professor and a lecturer as well. We have Mr. Charles Black, who was one of the leaders of the Atlanta student movement and a Morehouse College alumnus. We also have Dr. Georgianne Thomas, who was one of the foot soldiers of the Atlanta student movement, starting off when she was a freshman at Spelman College in 1960. She is an alumna of Spelman College and an adjunct professor at Clark Atlanta University, an author and an award-winning filmmaker. We also have two current students joining the panel today. Miss Zoe Landers is a junior at Clark Atlanta University. She is a dual degree student, majoring in civil engineering and physics, and a member of the Clark Atlanta University Isabella T. Jenkins Honors Program. And Mr. Michael McGirt, who is a junior at Morehouse College. He is a political science major and a Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Scholar. Welcome to this space, and we're so delighted to have you here on this day. We want to tell the story this day of the Atlanta student movement. We want to tell the story and tell it again. Tell it again in this season, particularly in America, where summer 2020 brought to the forefront America's prolonged resistance to honoring the humanity of Black people, of African Americans. The inhumane treatment that we saw before our eyes, summer 2020, happening to African Americans in this country, particularly the death of George Floyd in Minnesota, who was killed when a white police officer who had detained him with other police officers. When one white police officer held his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and the country witnessed this unarmed man lying on the ground. And after that happened, people took to the streets. Yet again, the history of racial injustice was on the forefront. In the midst of a pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, which is why we are even meeting virtually this way, the pandemic of racial injustice was revealed as well. And the global response that we saw to the death of George Floyd was just emblematic of what we already knew. We as Black people knew there was a virus in this country, or there is a virus in this country. We knew that. And people around the world of African descent, people of color knew it too, that the world was infected with racial injustice. And so people were able to speak up. They showed up, they stood up. People of all ages took to the streets, and especially young people, young adults, college students. But we've seen this before in Southern American cities in the 1950s, 1960s, especially in Atlanta, Georgia. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's no new thing under the sun. It says in Ecclesiastes 1:9, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. And so with this conversation, we revisit, we remember, we recall the names and the situations. We reflect on the Atlanta student movement in the 60th year since its founding. We make aware of this movement to some people who may be hearing this information for the first time, and then we also reintroduce it, if you will, to those who may have heard about it in passing, but may not have had a chance to hear firsthand accounts that we're going to hear today. So welcome to this virtual conversation, this intergenerational conversation, where we're going to raise the awareness of the Atlanta student movement. And we're also going to hear from the next generation to find out what they're doing and how this Atlanta student movement has impacted their lives. One of the main leaders of the Atlanta student movement was Mr. Lonnie King, the late Mr. Lonnie King, Morehouse College alumnus. And he would say, keep pushing. So here we are today to keep pushing, to continue the fight for social justice. And so I started this conversation today because everything has a beginning. So we're going to go to the beginning of the beginning. We're going to put this movement in context. How did this get started? And the most noted starting point for the Atlanta student movement is an appeal for human rights, which was a manifesto, if you will, that appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on March 9th, 1960, as a full-page ad. And one of the primary authors of that appeal was Dr. Rosalind Pope. Dr. Pope.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yes, if I were in your presence, I'd bow down. I am not worthy.
No. Okay. We'd give each other a hug.
Yes, we would. We would. I want you to really give us the story of an appeal to human rights. And what I'd like for you to do too, in giving us the story is, if you could just read a section of that for us. The part, if your heart is leading you to one section of it, then certainly, but my request would be to start with. We want to say clearly, unequivocally, but I like to have our virtual audience hear the words in your voice of an appeal for human rights. Just to share that, and then if you could then come back and take us back 60 years and tell us how that appeal came to be and how the students of the Atlanta University Center came together to put forth these timeless words.
Well, it's quite a story. I'll read a brief paragraph of our intentions because it says specifically that we do not intend to wait placidly for those rights which are already legally and morally ours to be meted out to us one at a time. Today's youth will not sit by submissively while being denied all of the rights, privileges, and joys of life. We want to state clearly and unequivocally that we cannot tolerate in a nation professing democracy and among people professing Christianity, the discriminatory conditions under which the Negro is living today in Atlanta, Georgia, supposedly one of the most progressive cities in the South. So that maybe sums it up, although that's sort of at the beginning of the appeal. But it's very interesting the way that it came to be written, and I need to go back to February of 1960. So this is earlier in that year from the time that we're actually honoring in October. But what had happened was I had been to Europe for a year to study as a Merrill Scholar, and I was in Yates and Milton, which was a famous drugstore on the corner amongst the people, among the colleges in the Atlanta University Center. I was sitting there with Lonnie King and Michael Bond. Not Michael, but who am I saying? Michael's the father, Julian. Mm-hmm. Julian Bond and Lonnie King. We were having coffee and we were complaining. All of us were complaining about the lack of freedom that we had as members of this country. And as we were drinking coffee and complaining, I was really complaining because coming from Paris, a year in Paris back to Atlanta, Georgia was not really my cup of tea. Mm-hmm. And I was very unhappy. And what happened was that Julian had a newspaper, the day's paper, and in that morning paper was the article that referred to the 4 gentlemen in North Carolina who had decided that they'd go to Woolworths to have coffee, just out of the blue. I mean, it was amazing. And we just almost jumped out of our seats that there were people who had the nerve to do that. And what was the name of, which college was it?
It was North Carolina A&T.
North Carolina A&T. These 4 well-dressed gentlemen came and sat at the counter. And of course, the people in the drugstore just had a fit. And no, you can't drink coffee here. You can't stay here. You're going to have to leave. And they tried to eject them. And eventually they did eject them. But they came back the next day and the next day and the next day. But what struck us was the fact that we're sitting in Yates and Milton complaining about our lack of freedom, and 4 Black young students had decided that they would take matters into their own hands. And of course, we could do nothing but follow. We have to do this. We have to make our stand. We have to tell the citizens of Atlanta that we cannot go along with being treated less than human beings. And as a matter of fact, that evening, Lonnie and Julian actually had a small crowd of people from Morehouse to meet and to begin deciding how we would attack this. Well, in the meantime, the college presidents had gotten wind of the fact that something was afoot, that the students are getting ready to revolt, that they're going to start trouble. And so the presidents of the 6 colleges that make up the Atlanta University Center called together 3 people from each of the 6 colleges. And I was president of the student body, so I was one of those from Spelman, along with Marion Wright Edelman, who had been the other student who had been to Europe the previous year along with me. Along with me, we were both Merrill Scholars. And then the vice president of the student body, whose name was Josephine Jackson, the 3 of us were from Spelman. And there were 3 people from each of the other colleges, plus 2 additional people, Lonnie and Julian, who were not officers of the college, but they were the instigators of this movement. So we were there with the presidents, and we stated that we had to do something to put an end to the way that we were treated as 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, just people who didn't count. We were way down the line of human beings. And interestingly enough, not everybody knows this, but Martin Luther King Jr. was in that meeting. He didn't say anything, but he had just come back from Montgomery, and he had been invited to the meeting, and he was there for the first time that the student instigators decided that they were ready to move. And what President Clement, who was the head of Atlanta University, which was the overarching school in the Atlanta University Center, Rufus Clement, who also had served on the Board of Education and was very well known, he challenged us that if we were going to demonstrate, if we were going to create a ruckus, if we were going to tear up the city of Atlanta, we needed to explain to them why we were doing it. And that's how I came to write An Appeal for Human Rights. It was at his, well, there was no equivocating about it. We were going to have to explain to the city of Atlanta. So within a short time, Julian Bond, who also was a journalist, and he was a wonderful typist, and Howard Zinn, who was one of the faculty at Spelman, had this huge, biggest typewriter you've ever seen. He owned, and he lived on campus with his family. And he invited us to come and use his typewriter and write the appeal at his house. So there were the 3 of us. There was Howard Zinn, professor. There was Julian Bond, and there was me. And we spent a whole night writing An Appeal for Human Rights. And we turned it into the faculty, not so much the faculty, but the presidents of the 6 universities. And very few changes were made. This is pretty much the way it was written to begin with, the way that we see it now. There, I think, were a couple of copies, which I'll think of eventually. I can't think of them right now. A couple of things that they wanted us to change, but nothing substantial. And that was the beginning of An Appeal for Human Rights. Then, within a week's time, it appeared on March 9th in the Atlanta Journal, the Atlanta Constitution. There were 2 papers in Atlanta at that time. There was the morning paper, the Atlanta Constitution, and the evening paper, the Atlanta Journal. And they were published on March 9th. So see, there was not that much time between the time that the young men in North Carolina had invaded Woolworths and the time that the appeal appeared. And it was a full page. It was huge. It was an amazing phenomenon. And of course, it created quite a stir. And I won't say much more without you asking questions, but that's how the appeal came to be.
Thank you. It did create quite a stir, and there were members of the other schools who signed on to that, and just want to call their names before I get to the next question. It was Willie Mays, who was the president of the Council of Students at Atlanta University, James Felder, the SGA for students at Clark College, Marion D. Bennett at the Intergenerational Theological Center, Don Clark, who's president of the student body at Morehouse College. Marion Bennett was the president of the SGA at ITC. Marianne Smith was the secretary of the Student Government Association.
Let me stop you right there about her, because the actual president of the student body at Morris Brown would not sign.
Oh, okay.
He refused to sign, and so the secretary signed for Morris Brown.
Thank you for sharing that. I never knew that piece of information. Thank you. And then you, Dr. Rosalind Pope, the president of the Student Government Association for Spelman College. One question I have not asked or I haven't gotten information on previously is, do you remember how much the ad costs and who paid for it? Where the money came from to pay for the ad?
It costs a lot of money. I think about $10,000. President Clemens raised the money from among the entrepreneurs, Black and white. People contributed, and Atlanta University forwarded the money to the Atlanta Constitution, and which meant that it would also appear in the Atlanta Journal. It was quite an expensive venture.
That is extraordinary. $10,000 in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay, so they were serious.
But it made it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the stir that it caused, Dr. Pope, is that the governor of Georgia, Governor Ernest Vandiver, read the ad and said that it could not have been written by students, and didn't sound like it was even written by anyone in this country. He called it, to use his words, he said it had the same overtones as anti-American propaganda, which seems somewhat ironic because the students were calling America to be America, and yet the governor of Georgia, who served from 1959 to 1963, Ernest Vandiver, is saying that what you're writing sounds anti-America. He called upon the students to cease and desist all of these efforts, which, in his words, can do much harm to all and gain no good for anyone.
That's exactly what he said. And it was astounding. It was just extraordinary. In Georgianne's film on the Atlanta student movement, just a minute. Foot Soldiers, class of 1964. It's quoted in the later copy of the Foot Soldiers. See, the Foot Soldiers of 1964 are the people who were freshmen in 1960, including your mother, Georgianne. And so, but I'm glad, in the past few days, I hadn't thought about him. I think about him all the time because the article that he wrote was so extraordinary. It was so way over the top. It was just outrageous. And he came to regret it. Let me just give you one little anecdote about that. Lonnie was receiving an honorary doctorate at one of the colleges further south in Georgia. And a whole bus of us went with him to receive this honorary degree. It was a white college. It was quite a big event. But interestingly, when we got to the school, we couldn't get off the bus because the daughter of the governor had come to stop us, to beg us, please not to mention that at this event that we were attending. And it turned out that the governor was very unhappy with himself that he had done that. And he never recovered from that kind of faux pas. And but I just thought it was interesting that we had to wait on the bus until the daughter of the governor made her plea for us not to expose him.
Did you tell the story? Did you mention the governor?
When?
When she asked you not to, did you all mention?
She was only talking to Lonnie at the front of the bus. She didn't talk with us as a whole, but she begged him to please not mention it and to ever mention it again, actually. But of course, that didn't happen because you just mentioned it, and it's an extraordinary piece. I think everybody should read it, and you will see what we were up against as human beings.
You were up against a system that was trying to tell you that you did not have any value and you were your humanity did not matter, even while the expectation of you was that you would certainly act humanely, even though you were not being honored as humans. And so you did not cease and desist. The movement kept going, and leaders like Mr. Charles Black, who's with us today, a student at Morehouse, was one of the, you call them instigators, one of the leaders who said, we're not going to sit placidly by and wait for this. So, Mr. Charles Black, thank you for being here. Glad to have you here today. If you can just share with us what was going on in your heart, mind, and soul with the writing of the appeal, seeing this ad in the paper, knowing what the governor had to say about it, recognizing the criticism that students were giving for simply making a decision to not only be human, but be Americans, and what happened next with the next, well, not the next, I guess the first set of marches in March, maybe a week later, to go forth, to take it to the streets. And now that you've stated your case, then you put some action behind that case. What happened there, and how did you get involved in this Atlanta student movement?
Well, let me take you back to my very beginning. Lonnie King approached me on campus. I was editor of the Maroon Tiger in my junior and senior year, and this was my junior year. So he knew who I was, and I knew who he was because he was an outstanding running back on our football team. So he approached me about coming to a meeting that evening at Sale Hall Annex. This was after he and Julian and Joe Pierce had approached folk at Gates and Milton's drugstore about what had happened in Greensboro, North Carolina. And there were somewhere between maybe 18, 24 or so of us at that initial meeting. And we discussed the possibility of doing some like actions in Atlanta. And toward the end of the meeting, Lonnie had requested that anyone in the meeting who had decided they would not want to participate for whatever reason, simply not talk about it, just going about your business, don't talk about it. Well, somebody did, and that led to that meeting that Rosalind just referenced with the presidents of the institutions at the Atlanta University Center. And I was at that meeting, and President Rufus Clement presided because he was head of the Atlanta University Consortium, which included all the schools. Their first attempt was to talk us out of doing this terrible thing because of several reasons. One, their funding for the schools came largely from white folk. They were, quote, liberals, but they felt that they would be disturbed by this action. They were also concerned about our safety and also their obligation to our parents. That we were sent there for education and not for this other stuff. So they suggested that we leave these matters to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who had fought such things in courts for generations. Our attitude, of course, was that we were not interested in evolutionary change, but in revolutionary change. So once they were convinced that we were going to do this thing, was when Dr. Clement suggested that we at least let the public know why we were doing what we were doing, and indicated that if we produced a manifesto, they would raise the funds to have it published in the newspapers. And as Rosalind said, it was published in the Atlanta Constitution, in the morning paper, the Atlanta Journal, the evening paper. It was also published in the Atlanta Daily World, but the Atlanta Daily World, that was opposed to our movement, insisted on payment in advance. The Journal-Constitution agreed to bill, Dr. Clement for the ads. The document was picked up by the New York Times and run as a full-page ad free of charge, and also by a paper in California, I think it was the LA Times. It was subsequently read into the congressional record by Senator Jacob Javits of New York. So it's a historic document that's in the records of the Congress. She did mention that Ernest Vandiver made those statements on television that she was talking about, and a clip of his doing that can be seen at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, where he's putting his foot in his mouth. Now, it should be noted that he did not say that no Black student in the state of Georgia couldn't have written the document. He said no student, which was an indictment of his own public education system. He wasn't aware of that at the time, but I think somebody pointed that out to him, which is why he repented himself later on, I suppose. So that was our first action, the publication of that document. Now, it might be noted that Lonnie had requested that I and Julian Bond, Morris Dillard, and Albert Brinson assist Rosalind in the writing of this document. And for some reason, Rosalind's cell phone wasn't working or something, and she couldn't reach any of us because there were no cell phones.
Tried.
So she contacted Lonnie and told him that she wasn't getting any help from us. And Lonnie said to her, "Just write the damn thing." So
Very words. That's right.
Yeah, as she indicated, and Julian with two fingers typed the document on the typewriter that she referenced. So it was a week later that we had our first sit-ins, and the sit-ins took place on March 15th at exactly 11 o'clock at 11 different locations around the city, some of which were five and dime type stores like Woolworths and the like, but also City Hall, County Courthouse, the state capitol, and the train stations and bus station. There were two train stations, the Union train station and the Terminal train station. The Terminal train station sat on the site where the Richard Russell Federal Building now stands. And that's where I was arrested, along with Martin King's brother, A.D. Williams King, and a group of others. And we were sentenced to 10 days at the city farm, down somewhere on a street called Ray Roads or something. I think it was. I haven't been back to see the place again, so I don't remember. But in any event, we were awakened at 4:30 in the morning, and the guys were taken out to a collard green field to chop weeds, and the girls sat on the ground outside of the facility peeling potatoes. And after 4 days, the public outcry was such that we were released from the city farm. But that was the start of our movement. And it proceeded apace from there, and it became, national news and, international news as well. So that's how we got started.
So if you can you please talk about the decisions that students made to either go to jail or not go to jail? Because I understand that when the movement started, when the marches would take place, that those decisions were made in advance, who would go to jail, who was willing to be arrested and who was not willing to be arrested. Can you share how that happened and how you made the decision to do that?
Yes, and of course, that's not what I signed up for initially. I came to Morehouse having declined an early admission scholarship the year before. But I came to Morehouse for education, and I chose to stay in Atlanta ever since because of the pretty ladies in the Atlanta University Center. I decided after 1 week, I can stay here. So that's what I signed up for. But in any event, with the start of the movement, what we did, we gave all of the students who were participating, about 200 or so of us, the option of, if given the chance, if the police come and you don't want to be arrested, and if you're given a chance to leave, you can leave at that time. And others who would choose to be arrested can stay and be arrested. And you still have the option of being bailed out of jail if you wanted to be bailed out, or to stay in jail if you chose. So I was in that last group, of course, who was ready to go to jail and stay. I remember calling my mother from the jail, and she told me, much to my surprise, that I just told your daddy that you were probably involved in that. Mm. How did she know that? I had no idea I'd be involved in any such thing, but I guess mother knows best.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The campaigns continued through the spring and through the summer. Once the point had been made that you all were serious, this was a unified body of the 6 schools in the Atlanta University Center. The decision had been made that we're going forward to claim our rights, to protest for them, to raise the conversation, to elevate our presence. There is interest beyond the 6 schools. You have persons in the community who are helping out and assisting as well. Clearly, their support for the students, because we were able to raise $10,000 to purchase an ad in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper through support of the schools and members of the community at large. And so when you get to the fall of 1960, the spotlight is definitely on Atlanta. And so you need some more folks to be involved. You need some foot soldiers. And so you have a student that comes from Gary, Indiana, to Atlanta, Georgia, in the person of Dr. Georgianne Thomas, who is a first-year student, as it's called now, but back then a good old college freshman, joining her classmates who were 16, 17, and 18 years old. Some of her classmates were 16 years old, who follow the leaders of the Atlanta student movement. They're following you, Mr. Black. They're following Lonnie King. They're following Dr. Herschel Challenor. They are following the Honorable Carolyn Long Banks. They're following people at all the 6 schools. Dr. Otis Moss. They're following. You got to have some foot soldiers. And so you have these women at Spelman College who say, we want to get involved. So Dr. Thomas, welcome to this virtual space. Tell us your story of coming to Atlanta from the North, walking into this dynamic scene and space, and how you got involved, what made you want to get involved. I hear people talk so much about a few years ago, all the rage was Black Girl Magic and hashtag Black Girl Magic. And I'm like, that's nothing new. You know, I know some serious Black Girl Magic stuff that's happening. I grew up in Black Girl Magic environment. Black women have been on the forefront, making things happen. You've got as soon as I learned that the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by 3 Black women, I wasn't surprised. Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. I was not surprised. I was surprised, that Black women had started, that movement, because we've always been on the forefront, making things happen. Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks and Joanne Robinson with the Montgomery bus boycott, Amelia Boynton in Selma, Fannie Hamer, in Mississippi. You've been there, so you come and Dr. Thomas, and you walk into this space. It's called Spelman College, and what happens next?
Thank you so much for having me as a part of this panel, because people like Charles Black and Dr. Pope and that group were the esteemed members of the Atlanta student movement. We were, and I was just a freshman. I was that. I had come from Gary, Indiana. I had come out of a sheltered Negro land. Margot Jefferson's book, Negro Land, I was that child. My mother had gone to Spelman. My father had gone to Morehouse. I was coming to school. I wasn't going to school with my white counterparts who all went to Indiana University or Northwestern or Michigan State. My mother said, "You're going to Spelman." She put me on the train. They told me not to speak to anyone, not to say anything, and nobody gave me any clue of where I was coming, because in her mind, I was going to get off at the terminal station downtown Atlanta, and I was going to go to Spelman College and matriculate and be a really good girl and be a very good student. That was her idea. That was my idea, except when I got off the train, there was nobody there to meet me. The young lady was running late, and I said, well, I'll just go in the waiting room and wait. And the sign said colored and white. And I said, whoa, I'm not colored. I'm going to the white one. And so off I went to try to find out with whom should I speak to find my way to this place called Spelman. Where as I was approaching the door, the young lady called to me and said I couldn't go in there. And I was thinking, well, why not? And she said, because that's a white waiting room. And I was just like, okay, this it makes sense to me. Not having all white teachers and gone to white school and being sheltered in Negro land, some stuff I just missed. And I don't fault anybody. It was just my parents were just trying to do the best they could to make sure I had a good education and that I was sheltered. So I got in the jitney, and which is a taxi, but a jitney, because we couldn't ride in a taxi. We had to ride in cars that were designated to the Black community, and they were called jitneys. And I went on Spelman's campus. Well, you had those good-looking men like Charles Black and, and Lonnie King and all those guys. They were looking good over there at Morehouse. Nobody told me that, that they were leaders. They just told me there was some fine folk over there. Okay, so I was at Spelman to get the education, but I was looking also, Charles. I heard you say something. Y'all were looking, I was looking too. So we didn't know the eminent Rosin Pope, because she had graduated. We met this other young lady who had also been in Paris. We were excited about her. That was Dr. Herschel Sullivan Challenor. And she said, well, we're going to have a meeting because we need to protest. And I was thinking, like, so what are we protesting? And she said, well, you can't go to the Woolworth and you can't go to stores. I'm thinking, like, when I was a kid, I used to get 25 cents. And for 25 cents, I can go to the Woolworths and get me a 15-cent hot dog, a 10-cent drink, or maybe a 5-cent drink. I had 5 cents left over. I could buy whatever I wanted in the Woolworth. We always went to Chicago, and I didn't know at the time that we went to the downtown Chicago where you could go. I didn't know we couldn't go outside of Chicago. So in my mind, I could go to the Woolworth. You couldn't go to the West End, they said, because that was segregated. The Ku Klux Klan was out there. I'm like, who is that? I mean, it was all not working for me. I was almost ready to just go back home. I worked at the Dairy Queen, which is nothing like what y'all know. But this man Mr. Sawyer owned a dairy place where you could get ice cream. So I had my little job. I was the popular girl there. And so, it was white, and I don't know. I didn't understand any of it. I didn't understand any of it, but I knew that I wasn't going to settle for that. I needed to know why I couldn't go to the Woolworth. And they said that you cannot go to the Woolworth, you have to go to the back door. And that was it for me. And her shell was so compelling. I'm telling you, she talked about being in Paris, and then she talked about freedoms, and she talked about, being able to go places. Now, in my mind, I had all of this already, but we didn't have it down here. And I just made a commitment. Well, my mother, Charles, was not happy at all. She said, I sent you to Spelman to get an education. I did not know that Dr. King was over there. I thought he was still in Alabama. You don't need to do any of that. So I said, okay. As I lined up and signed up to join with the Atlanta Student Movement Group, I didn't know any of you all. I didn't care. We were just 16, 17, and 18 years old. We wanted to make a difference. Many of the students had lived through segregation. There were only 5 of us. Can you imagine 5 people from the North? There was somebody from Philadelphia, somebody from Cleveland, Ohio. I was from Gary, Indiana. There was somebody from California, And then it was a young lady who had come from the armed services. So she had come from Paris or Germany or somewhere, traveling with her folk. So with the 5 of us were just the first ones in line, because we couldn't understand how is it I could go to school with white people? How is it I could have a white counselor? How can I have white people on the street with me? How could I work over there where we have white people? How could my bowling partner be white? How could my tennis partner be white? And then I come down here and I can't even eat with you? Are you kidding me? And so I was just compelled to make and follow them. We thought because they were old, they were 19 years old, you see. So when you were 19 to 20, that's senior. They were seniors. And but we looked up to them. We looked up to them. We looked up to Herschel like she was next to God. And when she said, get up and go, we got up and went. And then that I heard Charles talking about what they did during March, but what we did in October at the bottom of the hill. Once we made the march, October 19th, when we got up and marched out of Spelman, out of Clark College, out of Morehouse College, out of Morris Brown College, out of Atlanta University, and out of ITC. When we made that march down the street, we walked together and we were together. There was no separation of Morehouse and Spelman. We were on one accord. You could feel the spirit of oneness because we had great leadership and we followed them. So we walked down the street. I had never been that far off campus. I didn't sign out. I broke all the rules, but I didn't care because I figured I can go back to NA University. I can go somewhere up north to school, whatever. I knew I was doing this. So when we got down to the bottom of the hill, which right now in Atlanta, Georgia, that would be the stadium. And let me make this plug. I think that Arthur Blank, listen to me. I think that Arthur Blank should put a sign at the bottom of that, where that stadium is, and to commemorate that was the bottom of the hill where we had to go up that hill. Once you got to the bottom of the hill, people like Charles and Lonnie or that group said, you have to go back. If you don't want to do this, you need to go back. In my mind, why would you go back? Well, little did I know when we walked up that hill and I saw all those Klans people, I was thinking, Georgianne, my first thing was my mother's gonna kill me. That's number one. And then secondly, I don't even know where I am. I don't know how to get back to campus. And thirdly, I don't know what's gonna happen to me. But you know what? I'm gonna do this. I am going to do this. I was committed and I did it. And when the man jumped out of the crowd and burned me with his cigarette, let me back up. We had already had training. The Atlanta Student Movement had set up some great training for us with Dr. King at the church on Chestnut, Rush Memorial. And so we already knew that you couldn't be a part of this if you didn't practice nonviolence. We already had that part. When that man jumped out of that crowd, first we already been spat upon so many times. And then we just said, okay, keep singing. We keep singing. We had to sing. But when he burned me with his cigarette, my Gary, Indiana wanted to come out. That not bad. I'm not talking bad about Gary. I'm just saying my daddy, lived on the west side of Chicago. All that came out. I wanted to, as the young people say, clap back. But I had been trained. So I took the burn. My arm was hurting me. But when he finished burning me with his cigarette, I didn't stop marching. I kept holding on to my little placard and I kept going because we had made a commitment. And if the older ones, the Atlanta Student Movement people could do this, I know my little freshman self could do it. And so we did it and we followed them. And I'm grateful to this day that I broke all the rules because that was the first time I was going to get sent home by Spelman. They even put a letter out that I'm sure you all will talk about later. But I didn't care what they were talking about. All I knew was that they would deny me a right to go get a hot dog. They wouldn't let me go get a drink. They didn't let me spend my 25 cents. They didn't let me go somewhere that I was used to going, and I didn't like it. And if whatever I needed to do to make a difference, whether it's for selfish reasons or for reasons that Herschel Sullivan Challenor led us with the Atlanta Student Movement, I am so glad to this day that I stood my ground And to this day, I show my students the burn on my arm because it reminds me of the hate and what we had to go through just to get to eat with people who right now don't give a flip about us eating with them in 2020.
Woo!
Wow.
Wow.
Passion.
Now, that passion just stirs my soul, and the unity that you talk about, the 6 schools coming together, no line of demarcation between what school, what mascot, what team, what you have the shared history that's there, and more so importantly, the shared vision to go forward, because this matters to us all and it's bigger than us, and we have the power to make this happen. We understand the power in our voice, the power in our unity of moving down the street, coming out of all the schools at the same time, and making your way to downtown Atlanta, to the bottom of the hill, which is, for those persons who know Atlanta, Northside Drive and Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, that intersection there, which is formerly Hunter Street. And so you get there and really have the symbol of going up a hill, because you were going up a hill as students trying to make your case to the world, really, that this is what we're experiencing as Black people in this country is it's unacceptable, and we're not going to just stand for it. I do want to have Dr. Pope or either Mr. Black just give us briefly what happened on October 19th, 1960. That day is marked in history because of the way that the movement moved from public institutions to private institutions, where multiple locations were chosen on one day, primarily Rich's department store being targeted on that day for what Rich's stood for. If you can share not only the significance of having those multiple demonstrations on one day, on October 19th, but the arrests that were made, who was arrested on that day, and then what happens after that, and why it matters in 2020.
Well, let me note that our movement was extremely well organized from the start. Everything we did was done with military precision. We cased the joints, as it were. We had people to go and look and find telephone booths that were near, so we could have watchers there to report. And we had rides organized and the like. But on that particular day, you need to have some background. One is that Rich's was everybody's favorite department store. They had a stated motto that no sale is ever complete until the customer is satisfied. And they actually lived by that, which meant that if you bought something from Rich's today, and 10 years later, 15 years later, you didn't want it anymore, it didn't work anymore, or whatever, you could take it back, no questions asked, and they would either exchange the item or give you your money back. Rich's also had a lot of interesting attractions. At Christmas time, they had the big tree on the top of the bridge, and they would have choirs on each of the 4 or 5 levels that would sing, and the tree would light up. They had live reindeer up there near the tree. They had what was called the Pink Pig that kids could ride in, a little monorail that went around the tree. And they had a secret shop, which was my favorite thing, because you could leave your kids at the secret shop with a list and a budget for them to shop for family members and friends while you went and shop for them for a couple hours. So it was everybody's favorite store. We knew that if Rich's fell, that everybody else would fall as well. And just to jump forward a little bit, we cost Rich's more than $10 million during the Christmas holiday that year, which is what brought them around. But as relates to October 19th, Dr. King had not been involved in the Atlanta activities at all. By agreement with his parents and the established Black leadership in town, their attitude essentially was that, we got this. You do Albany and Montgomery and all that stuff, but there are 24 of us here who can do what you can do. And he had agreed with his parents and with the established Black leadership, the old guard, as we call them, not to be involved in the Atlanta activities. Okay, so prior to October 19th, Dr. King had been arrested for driving. The story varies as to why why he was actually arrested. He was stopped, however, because he had a white woman in the front seat with him, the famous author Lillian Smith, and Coretta was in the back seat, and they were taking her, um, I think, to a doctor's appointment after she'd had lunch with him, and uh, and that's why they were actually stopped. But the charge was that he was driving an automobile with a Georgia license plate while he still had an Alabama driver's license, which of course was a major offense. He was taken to court. I was in the courtroom, and Judge Mitchell uh, sat sideways with a comic book while the defense, led by Attorney Donald Hollowell, was presenting his case, and the judge was ignoring him entirely. And when he rested, the judge simply turned and said, "Are you finished?" 4 months. And King was sentenced to 4 months in prison because of this terrible offense. But his sentence was probated. Okay. All right. Come October 19, Lonnie had convinced King to be arrested with him at Rich's department store, partly because our movement was kind of losing some steam. You know, it had been going on for a while. We started in March, and it's October, and people were, want to do Halloween shopping and whatever else. And King had explained to Lonnie that he had this understanding with his parents and the established Black leadership not to be involved in the Atlanta activities. And Lonnie finally convinced him to go by quoting King's father on him with a line that said, "You cannot lead from behind." And as a result of all that, King was convinced to go to Rich's with Lonnie and some others. And he made the stipulation that if I'm going to be arrested, there should be at least a couple of pretty ladies arrested with us. So you will see in the picture Marion Price in between the two kings when they were arrested, and there were some other ladies outside of that shot. By the way, Rich's was on the site of the Sam Nunn. Sam Nunn is on the site where Rich's was, and there's a huge mural, not a mural, mosaic on the wall that's probably 30, 40 feet tall of that scene that was from the newspaper of the Kings being arrested with Marilyn Price there. So when King was arrested, it was in violation of his parole. So he was then arrested again and taken to Reedsville prison in the middle of the night. Like I understand, like 3 o'clock in the morning. In the back of a paddy wagon with a loose German Shepherd dog. And you have to understand that Reedsville was a notorious prison in Georgia, where the guards were known to be very brutal and sadistic. They would beat people up, but they would also pit prisoners against each other and would allow some of them to have weapons that resulted in the death of other prisoners. So it was that kind of thing going on down there. And that's the environment that King was being put in. So everybody was concerned for his safety. He had indicated later that I was the most afraid he'd ever been in his life. So everybody was afraid for his life, actually, that he would even survive this prison. This was 2 weeks before the election, the presidential election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. October 19th, here we are again, approaching that same period. We'll be like a couple of weeks before the election. At that time, Richard Nixon was leading in the polls by double digits across the nation. And while the Nixon people were trying to decide whether they should intervene in any way about this business of King's being arrested, which had become international news, because at this time, King was extremely well known all over the world. And while they were trying to decide if they should intervene in any way, the Kennedy campaign, Lewis Martin, a Black person on their campaign staff, convinced them that they should do something. And so John authorized Bobby to make a call down to the governor, and they got King out of prison. And as a result of that, now Daddy King prior to this time had said, I don't know if I can vote for a Catholic for president. He's Southern Baptist preacher. But But the Kennedy campaign published what was known as the Blue Bomb, and it was on blue paper. And what it was a pamphlet about this whole situation. And it was titled the Case of Martin Luther King, something to that effect. And they quoted in this pamphlet Daddy King and I think Coretta and Martin Jr. and I think Abernathy and Walter Branch, I believe, were the folk quoted in there. And there were statements of appreciation and praise for the Kennedys for having intervened on King's behalf. Now, this flyer was distributed in every major city that had large Black populations. They put out 50 million flyers, I understand, all over the country. And as a result of that, Blacks who had been voting Republican up until that time, out of loyalty to Lincoln and whoever else, with the exception of Roosevelt, they switched and voted for Kennedy for the first time for a Democrat in a very, very long time. And whereas Nixon had been leading by double digits nationwide, Kennedy won the election by less than one vote per precinct nationwide. And it was as a result of that action that then every major city with large Black populations voted for Kennedy except one. That was Atlanta. And the reason that Atlanta didn't move from the Republican column to the Democratic column was because of a guy named John Calhoun, who was the world's greatest community organizer and a Republican. So he managed to keep the majority of Blacks in the Republican column in that election. But the world does not know that story very much, that if it had not been for that action of King being arrested on October 19th, the richest department store in Atlanta, Georgia, Nixon would have been president instead of Kennedy at that time.
I like to say that's a story that needs to be. I hope that when that people are able to see this broadcast, because I didn't know that story like you're telling it, Mr. Black. And it's in our movie, Foot Soldiers, the class of 1964. I'm glad my daughter did the movie. But just to hear you tell it from first person, it's just so powerful. And I hope that when this is played over and over again, people can hear the real first person stories that you and Dr. Pope are giving us that we wouldn't know otherwise. I mean, I was there, but I'm hearing some things for the first time because like my daughter said, or Reverend Sanders said, I'm sorry, that we were freshmen. We were 16, 17, 18 years old. We were just following you guys. But even 60 years later, it's very, very important that these stories get told. And let me just say this, and I apologize for my time. I am sometimes very upset that we start the civil rights narrative at 1965. It didn't start in 1965. The 1960 story is very seldom told. No offense to anybody who did everything in 1965. No offense to those people who came up and out of the 1965 events. But, we could go back to the 50s and let's start with 1960. October 1960 is a lost day in the history of the civil rights program. When people tell me they marched, I didn't see any of those people that are prominent now in line with me, October the 1960. I saw Charles Black. I saw Lottie King. I saw the people who were in the Atlanta student movement. But Julian Bond, we all knew him. I saw my classmates. But I didn't see a whole lot of people who say they were with us. I don't mind you can have all the bright lights, but don't forget the people on whose shoulders you stood, like we stood on some shoulders also.
There's one key point I wanted to make about our movement, Reverend, and that is that a movement is by its nature multidimensional. And what that means is that it involves a lot of people with a deep commitment to high ideals, doing a lot of different things over a long period of time. Okay, missing any of those elements, you may have an action or protest or a slogan, but you don't have a movement. And ours was a movement. It involved people who were not prepared to go to jail, driving us to the locations where we were picketing and sitting in. Our folk made sandwiches for us. They made phone calls for us. The big thing was, and of course they boycotted the stores that we asked them to.
Right.
And the biggest thing was that people put their homes up as collateral to bail us out of jail. You know, they didn't know us individually. We didn't know them. I still to this day have no idea who bailed me out of jail. But our movement had that kind of moral suasion that people were willing to do these things in support of our efforts if they themselves were not willing to be directly involved. So anybody planning any kind of movement need to keep that in mind. Don't ever expect everybody to do everything you're prepared to do, because it all makes a difference, even the making of sandwiches and making phone calls. So I always like to make that point about movements.
I appreciate that, Mr. Black, and hearing this firsthand, that firsthand account is incredible. And you can read it in a book, but to hear someone who was there and who was a part of it is even more compelling, because I'm learning new things as well as you're telling the story. The October 19th, 1960 day did help change the course of history in this country. And that is one of the lasting legacies of the Atlanta student movement. I mean, it moved a group of people from one political party to another. And we're still there 60 years later. And for all of the conversations that take place, and even sometimes the criticism that African Americans get for largely voting for Democrats. You have to understand, that that particular history. That we didn't wake up as Democrats. We started as one party, and we moved to another party. The headline in the Atlanta Inquirer newspaper, one of the Black newspapers in Atlanta at the time, on November 14th, 1960, that headline reads, "Negroes clinched Kennedy win." Negro surge gave demos key states. And that's the legacy that happens from October 19th, 1960. In addition to raising the consciousness of the people of Atlanta when you're targeting a flagship store, which is the comment you made about long-term commitment and taking a lot of people to make things happen and for a movement to be sustainable. That leads us to bring in our next generation activists, Miss Zoe Landers and Mr. Michael McGirt, a student at Clark Atlanta University, Ms. Landers, and student at Morehouse College, Mr. McGirt, because you gotta, it couldn't stop in 1960. It has to still keep going. And in 2020, we still have to keep pushing. So I just want to bring in those two students to share what you're feeling, the impact these firsthand stories are having on you, some of the things that you are doing as activists now, and how what you're hearing will inform what you do going forward. And if you are aware of some of this history to this degree prior to today, and if that impacted in any way some of the activism that you are involved in, we'll start with you, Ms. Landers.
Hi, everyone. I am a junior at Clark Atlanta University. I have learned a lot from Dr. Thomas. We've become very close over the past year, and becoming close to her, I've been able to learn about the history of the AUC and the Atlanta student movement. I've learned about the maps of where the historic places are on campus, and she actually has inspired me to speak out on this type of topic. Being from Alabama, I have faced a lot of racism throughout high school. And after meeting her, I started speaking up at my old high school. They started meeting with me on ways to become more inclusive and diverse. And I used that platform that I was given by them to actually speak up on things that they have failed to do in the past. I understand that they're trying to move forward, but we have to understand what was wrong with what they did before. So yes, I have learned some of this history. I've seen the Foot Soldiers documentary and I've read about it, and I've been able to learn things from Dr. Thomas as a teacher, but more as a mentor from her.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McGirt, what about you, being a junior at Morehouse College? What are some of the things you are involved in? How is this conversation impacting what you do?
So, myself, I'm very much involved in SJ myself. And I sit on the board of trustees as a student representative for Morehouse College. So I know as an SGA over the past summer with everything going on with the different events taking place, especially around Black Lives Matter, it was big on SGA from all three schools to come together and to unify as one, to have a group message like Dr. Pope was talking about earlier. And so, I mean, hearing to see history repeats itself over again and seeing how it's happening is definitely like a great benefit to see that we're going in the same direction that we're going in, to truly make a change and create history while we're living it right now.
Yes. And what about both of you? I've been asking a lot of questions. Do you all have any questions for our panelists that they're neither here at your fingertips? Anything you want to ask them?
I have a question. So, like, at the time, were you guys aware that you guys were really like making history and changing and creating as much change as you do now? No, like looking back on it, did you know at the time you were doing that?
Well, I didn't have any real sense of history. First place, I never had a decent history class in high school or in college for that matter. It was a matter of remembering some names and dates and places. Uh, I regret that deeply because I've taken a real interest in history since then. But we also had a limited awareness, as perhaps you do, of the shoulders on which we stood. The generation immediately before us and the generation before them, the things that they had done that made it possible for us and that inspired us to do what we did. And I kind of repented the fact that after our generation of doing things, we didn't make a point of mentoring and preparing the other generations following us to understand the shoulders on which they stood. I have in later years done much more of that. I've been involved with student groups a lot over the past couple of decades because of that. But at the time, we were doing what we thought needed to be done. And we saw an effective way of making change based on what the guys had done in Greensboro, North Carolina. We were already living through discontent and unhappiness. And we were not unaware of the circumstances under which we lived and wanted change. But prior to that time, the only way we had seen change being made was through the courts. And that was a lengthy, timely process that if we had litigated each item, one at a time, it had been another 400 years before we were ever to achieve what we wanted to achieve in the short order.
I wanted to say that I didn't know anything. I was just, when I tell you I was a freshman with my head in the sand, I was a freshman with my head in the sand. I just didn't like what was going on. I didn't like what they were telling me I could not do. And so history was not anything I thought I was making. I'm like Charles, I hated history. You had to take history, so I just had to take it. But I've learned more since then. And what has helped me now is that I teach at Clark Atlanta University. I didn't get my doctorate until I was 66 years old in 2006. And that was after breast cancer. And so it means a lot to me now to share with the young people. I did meet Miss Landers and students like her just to share our story. And I'll tell you what prompted my daughter and I doing the movie. We had a book had come out of Spelman College that had talked about the movement, but I didn't see any names in there of my classmates. And I told my daughter, I said, there's a whole group of people that nobody knows anything about, that nobody's talking about. And we marched also. And then, I never met Dr. Roslyn Pope personally, the person who wrote the manifesto. And I mean, I just thought we should just do something to put all this back on the map. And we were blessed to live near and meet Charles Black in person again as adults. But I just felt like something was missing. And my daughter was willing to take time to help put this movie together, Foot Soldiers, the class of 1964, and bring us and document it, because our history sometimes is revised. Revised. If we wanted to make sure we didn't do the movie without talking to Dr. Pope and making sure we had all the information, because we want to make sure that we document what has been done. And I'm hoping that the Zoes and I'm sorry to get the young man's name, but that this generation would document what's going on now. And I like the fact that Mr. Black brought up that we're in the same place where we were in 1960 and 2020. It's October, and look what we're facing. Look what's going on in the world. And I'm hoping that we're able to show this video. I wish it could be shown across the world, because I think the conversations that have come up today will do something to impact, I believe, Charles, especially some of the things you said. I do believe that it will make an impact on people wanting to vote, those who don't want to vote, those who say nothing is going to happen if they vote. I believe if Mr. Hayes could get this video in as many places as it can go before November 3rd, that I really do believe that it would be impactful, just as it was in 1960.
It's extraordinary that we have Charles Black, because he was there from the first day after we had met at Yates and Milton, and then they had this little group that met the next day, and he's been there from then until now and knows all of the ins and outs of what transpired and knew all of the people. And so we're just very fortunate that he's in our midst. There's so much understanding and so many details that he's the only one who knows all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, he shared it with us.
That's very kind of you, Dr. Roslyn. I call her that because she has 3 PhDs, everybody. By the way, there's a book coming out in January. The author called me on yesterday. He'd interviewed me 2 years ago in Lonnie about the October 19th situation. The book is called something like 9 Days to Save Dr. King's Life and Elect a President, something to that effect. And he sent me a preliminary draft of the content for me to review that I got last night, so I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. But I'll make sure that you guys are all aware of it.
Please do.
And it is extremely, from what I've seen of it, it seems to be a scholarly piece that gives a good feel for what was happening leading up to that time and afterwards.
Oh, good.
So I'd mention it.
Let us know.
The history is rich indeed, and I do want to have Ms. Landers and Mr. McGirt just weigh in as we come to a close in terms of you two are there on the front lines of today, those same front lines that our veterans are so graciously sharing with us on this day. What is it that we can do to help you? I am not a veteran, but I am older than both of you. I'm the next generation. That is my mother, Dr. Georgianne Thomas. And so I call myself an heir, if you will, of this movement, of the civil rights movement. But what can we do? What can those who come before you, what can we do or share or still tell? We don't have enough time in this forum, but how can we still share with you, with your generation, and what you are doing? What do you see that we may not be aware of, that we can share some lessons with you or some insight and assist what you are doing to take this movement forward, to keep pushing and keep pushing.
I believe you guys have handed us the baton in the best way possible. We've learned everything that we possibly could have learned from you guys, and I would love to learn even more. In today's society, we are struggling with people fighting for being activists in a performative way. They're doing it in ways just to look good and not actually wanting to help the cause. And so that's what I believe our generation is struggling with. And then we're struggling with intersectionality, not understanding that we have multiple inequalities that we struggle with. Like I struggle with as being a Black woman. I am Black and I'm also a woman. So I'm learning the ropes of struggling with both of those and fighting and being an activist towards both of those inequalities in America.
I believe that the biggest assistance that the past generation can help us with is just teaching them the lessons that they've already learned. So, like you guys mentioned earlier, how people came in and taught you guys about civil disobedience and how to march and how to properly protest and how to organize in a military fashion. I think that's one of the biggest helps that we could have right now. One of the biggest losses that we have right now is that piece of organization. So as the older generation, if you guys could come in and teach us to be more organized, I think that would be the most helpful thing.
Wonderful.
But there you have it. We've heard from Dr. Walson Pope, Mr. Charles Black, Dr. Georgianne Thomas, veterans of the Atlanta student movement. We've heard from the next generation, Ms. Zoe Landers and Mr. Michael McGirt, students at Clark Atlanta University and Morehouse College, respectively. We thank you for being a part of this intergenerational conversation. Keep pushing the intergenerational conversation commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Atlanta student movement. We honor everyone who's involved in this movement, everyone who made signs but could not march, everyone who stayed back and took notes in classes for those who were marching, everyone who made sandwiches and provided beverages, who provided transportation, who provided money, everyone who cut up their richest credit card and sent it back in during the boycott, everybody who bails any and everybody out of jail, parents and loved ones who prayed, churches who opened their doors for training, college professors and university administration members who helped and supported the movement. We're thankful for all the behind the scenes, closed doors, meetings, strategizing. Thank you to everyone who had anything to do with paving the way to get us to where we are here today, so we can stand on your shoulders. And so the way is still made, and we shall continue to go forward down that path. In the Appeal for Human Rights, this statement stands: we, the students of the 6 affiliated institutions forming the Atlanta University Center, Clark, Morehouse, Morris Brown, and Spelman Colleges, Atlanta University, and the Intergenerational Theological Center, have joined our hearts, minds, and bodies in the cause of gaining those rights which are inherently ours as members of the human race and citizens of these United States. And so we've come this far by faith, joined by our hearts, our minds, and our bodies. Now let's keep going forward. Keep pushing with power. I'm Evelyn Sanders Swafford, and it's been a delight to be in this space with you today. Thank you for joining us. We welcome Atlanta City Council member Michael Julian Bond, who is the son of the late Julian Bond, one of the primary leaders of the Atlanta student movement while he was a student at Morehouse College. Councilmember Bond is here today to share a proclamation from the Atlanta City Council recognizing the 60th anniversary of an appeal for human rights and the Atlanta student movement.
Hello and good evening. It is great to be here with you, and it is really an honor, privilege, and pleasure for me to be here today to present a proclamation to those who started a movement that not only changed Atlanta, but ultimately the world. What I have here today is a proclamation from the Atlanta City Council. And the proclamation reads in pertinent part a story about the students from the Atlanta University Center that gathered at the old Yates and Milton drugstore one afternoon in early March of 1960s. Those students were Lonnie King, Joseph Pierce, and Julian Bond. But they were amongst many others who often used Yates and Milton as a gathering spot on the campuses of the Atlanta University Center. One of the things that they were talking about, and they often had spirited conversations between classes, was the Greensboro movement, in which where 4 students sat down at lunch counters and began a sit-in movement. One student, Lonnie King, said to another, Julian Bond, in the presence of Joseph Pierce, and he asked, should this movement, or this type of movement, happen in Atlanta? And Julian Bond said, sure, it'll eventually happen here. But then Lonnie King said, don't you think we need to make it happen here? And Julian Bond responded, sure. And then he said, before he could answer, Lonnie gave them the direction to Joseph Pierce and Julian Bond. You take one half of Yates and Milton, I'll take the others, and then let's begin to organize. And so they did that. They organized the students that were present. They began to have meetings around the Atlanta University Center. And ultimately, they met with the leadership of the colleges who were not terribly excited about what they were proposing. But Dr. Clement, who was the de facto head of the Atlanta University Center as president of what was then Atlanta University, gave them the inspiration, or some might say direction, to write a manifesto about what they were about to do. Those students gathered and they became the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. They drafted a document largely written by one of the panelists of tonight's program, Dr. Rosalind Pope, and they laid down the concerns of not only themselves as students and African Americans in Atlanta, but of the greater African American community in the city. That document was published in March of 1960, that in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. It also was published in the New York Times, in the Harvard Crimson, and ultimately was published in papers across the United States and the world, and now resides in the Library of Congress. That became a seminal document for which their movement, the constitution of their movement. They began activities around the city of Atlanta, sitting in here at Atlanta City Hall and at lunch counters and other public buildings all across Atlanta. Ultimately, the movement, as you heard tonight in great detail, hinged on a pivotal event that happened in October 19th of 1960. It was the first time that Dr. Martin Luther King became involved directly as a participant in the Atlanta student movement. This was his first public activity marching with the students after several of the committee went to him and beseeched him to become involved. Why this is important is that Dr. King had pledged to the political leadership in the Black community at the time that he would not lead any major movements since returning to live in Atlanta after leaving Alabama. He was actually sent a letter by the Black political leadership asking him to do so, and he wanted to keep his word. But the movement was gaining momentum. They were picketing at what was called Atlanta's favorite store, Rich's Department Store, which is the leading department store in the southeastern United States. Just imagine Macy's in New York by comparison, but covering that type of influence over the southeastern region of the United States. Dr. King joined that movement and was subsequently arrested. He was taken to the DeKalb County Jail, where he was sentenced in the court and was going to go to Reidsville Prison. But he had disappeared from record. His wife could not find him. No one could locate him or tell them where he was or what what his disposition was, though many of the students who were arrested were released. So that began a call to the political candidates running for president at the time, principally Richard Nixon, who was a Republican. And what most people forget is that most African Americans at that time were what were called Lincoln Republicans. They were loyal to the Republican Party, voting heavily for Republicans with the exception of FDR. And so Nixon was first given the chance to intervene and try to help find out what had happened to Dr. King. His campaign sent their condolences to Mrs. King and their well wishes, but did not get involved. And so they turned to the Kennedy campaign, the Democrats. Most of the South was Democratic. They used to be called Dixiecrats. And that give you some kind of indication of their mindset. So the Kennedy campaign got involved, found out where Dr. King was, and tried to make his release happen. This swayed the political fortunes and opinions in Atlanta. And so all over the Southeast, Daddy King, who had been a Republican, who at one time didn't know if he could vote for a Catholic, he stated that from the pulpit, changed his mind and endorsed Kennedy. And so that endorsement went throughout the southeastern United States in a blue flyer, which was euphemistically called the Blue Bomb. And that blue bomb changed the direction of the presidential election of 1960 and threw it in Kennedy's favor. So the Atlanta student movement, not only did it desegregate Atlanta, not only did it seed the mythology of the city of Atlanta and its great phrase, the city too busy to hate, and made it live up to that pledge, it changed and showed the world how nonviolent citizen action can change the world. And so with that, for those of you who are on the call that are members of the Atlanta student movement, a grateful city designates October the 19th, 2020 as Atlanta Student Movement and Appeal for Human Rights Day in our fair city. In witness thereof, I have set my hand and have caused the seal of the city of Atlanta to be hereunto affixed. Congratulations, our noble progenitors in the freedom movement. It is through you that all of our freedoms rest. God bless you and thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bond, for sharing that wonderful proclamation with us. And we thank you and salute you for all the wonderful work you are doing and have done to make sure the story of the Atlanta student movement remains a vital part of Atlanta's history.